Very happy to have today Professor Dyson from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Professor Dyson has had a very distinguished career, as you all can read in the program we prepared for you. He worked with such luminaries as Richard Feynman and Robert Oppenheimer, so he's seen a lot of history. And today's presentation is going to be developing at the history, the life he's had, a historical perspective on the science and technology that he has personally been involved with, or at least had very good front row seats, good tickets to see it. Professor Dyson has been at the Institute for Advanced Study since 1953, and we had a very pleasant lunch this afternoon. And when I was growing up, I grew up in Newark, next door, and one of the stories I heard when people asked me, what are you going to study? I said, physics. I heard a story from one of my neighbors, and he told me that the Institute for Advanced Study, which was founded by the Bamberg family from the department store that's in downtown Newark, that it originally was supposed to be in Newark. And I always thought it was one of those urban legends, because you always hear about Newark, how they're taking the name out of the airport and such like that. You always hear those stories. And I would be imagining Albert Einstein walking around downtown Newark. So I asked Professor Dyson, I heard this legend, is this true? And he said yes. Originally, that was one of the proposed places, and the Bamberg family wanted it to be in this general vicinity. But it turns out they passed away, but they didn't change their will, and and it ended up in Princeton, New Jersey. So it's just an interesting side note that I learned about today. So without further ado, let me present Professor Freeman Dyson, who will talk about the 4 revolutions that he has witnessed and lived through. So thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me here. I didn't really know Jaki. It was a shame. I should have got to know him. He was at the Institute at the same time I was there. But of course, that place is just a motel. People are coming and going all the time. So it's just a matter of chance if you happen to get to know them while they're there. So I missed a big opportunity, and not the only one. So I'll talk about the history. I'm mostly now a historical monument. I've had great luck to live longer than most, and so I'm most of my time now is not doing science but writing, and so I'll tell you about the earlier times when I was doing science, which were exciting times. And I think the next 50 years are probably going to be at least as exciting. But I don't talk about those because the beauty of science is you never can tell what's going to happen next. Well, my life really started as a statistician, not as a scientist. I was 19 years old, had to go and work for World War II. I was in England at the time, a British. I grew up as a Britisher. So everybody at 19 was sent to work for the war. Since I had the scientific background, I wasn't required to fight. Instead, I was put to be a statistician at the headquarters of the British Bomber Command, which was the part of the Air Force concerned with strategic bombing. So our job was, in fact, the destruction of cities in Germany, which we did as well as we could, which was pretty badly. And particularly, I was in charge of bomber losses, that is, of collecting data, understanding bomber losses, trying to figure out why our bombers were getting shot down, and trying to do something about it. And I failed dismally. This was a disastrous campaign, this bombing campaign, both from our point of view and from the German point of view. I mean, it was very bad for the Germans. They got killed and slaughtered in quite considerable numbers, mostly civilians. And it also cost our air crews their lives. It was a murderous business. These boys who went to fly the planes had one chance in 4 of surviving a tour. The tour was 30 operations. So that's what they had to face. They'd one chance in 4 they'd come out of it at the end. And then they were invited to volunteer for a second tour, which many of them did, amazingly. A lot of them came back for the second tour, those that were still alive. And a very, very small few, of course, came out of the second tour alive. Well, so that was what I was living with, and it gave me a taste of war, which has remained with me ever since. I mean, war is worse even than you imagine it, from every point of view, even if you're winning. So I've spent a lot of the rest of my life trying to deal with that problem. That is, first of all, trying to get some control of nuclear weapons, trying to get rid of nuclear weapons, trying to establish some sort of sensible foreign policy in this country. So I spent a substantial fraction of my efforts, both in early times I went to Washington to work for the Disarmament Agency, which was a very good place to be in the early times when it actually cut some ice, which it no longer does. And also with my writings, there's a substantial fraction of my writings which is concerned with war and peace. So that's my background. But I won't talk much about that. I'm more interested today in what was going on in science. I had the great luck to have come onto the scene at the end of World War II. I was released from Bomber Command by the bombs, as we thought. Now I have reason to doubt that, but I'll talk about that a bit too. The situation in 1945 was that 4 revolutions happened, more or less exactly at that moment, more or less by chance when the war came to an end. It was a tremendous piece of luck for those of us who were young. So we came onto the scene with all these exciting things going on. So the four revolutions which I'll talk about are the space, nuclear, the genome, and the computer. They all were born just about then. Well, space, of course, actually began the year before. I was in London at the time, and the V2 rockets were coming down on our heads. And we were very happy about that because we knew that every V2 cost the Germans as much as a high-performance airplane. They were very high-tech spacecraft, at least as expensive as an airplane, and of course involved a huge amount of German talent and a huge amount of expenditure. And they were militarily completely useless. So our friend von Braun, who was then in charge of the German rocket program, he was actually supervising the unilateral disarmament of Germany. And we were devoutly thankful to him for that. And it was a wonderful thing to hear these rockets come down because you heard the bang first. They were coming supersonically down from the sky. So you heard the bang first, and then you heard the whistle of the missile coming through the air. And then you knew it missed, it didn't hit you, so then you didn't have to worry. It was just the opposite of being bombed the ordinary way. If you're being bombed by an ordinary airplane, you hear the airplane before the bomb, and it's much worse. Makes you nervous. Anyhow, so we were very thankful to von Braun. But we knew at that time this was the beginning of the space age. If you could throw rockets into the sky, you could also throw rockets all over the solar system. The hard part is getting off the ground. And so once you had rockets, you could certainly explore the solar system. And so we had grand dreams of going out into space ourselves. In due course, of course, this happened. We expected it would happen sooner. It was from our point of view, it took a long time, but still I was definitely with it. And we had always our eyes on that particular game. It was interesting to hear afterwards from Braun what actually happened on the German side, that he actually talked to Hitler when the program was getting started, this V2 program with the rockets. And Hitler immediately understood the problem. Hitler, in fact, asked the right question. He said, how long will it take to make 1 million of these? And Hitler said, that's only artillery, that's all it is. It's just long-range artillery. It's no good just having a few thousand. If you want artillery, you have to have millions. And when are you going to have millions? And von Braun very cleverly changed the subject and said, jawohl, mein Führer, and yes, sure, my leader, and promised he would have millions, which of course he never possibly would have a hope of doing. So, in fact, Hitler never followed through. Hitler asked the question but never got the answer. But it was the right question. And so the V2 could only have been interesting from a military point of view if it had been a weapon like artillery with millions, which could have stopped an invasion fleet or something of that kind. Never were enough to do anything consequential. The total number of V2s ever made was about 10,000. The number actually launched was about 5,000. And so they were completely uninteresting from a military point of view. It's amusing that Hitler was in fact not such a great war leader. He had too many things to do, and he didn't actually follow through on most of the important questions. Having a dictator is not usually a good idea. Well, anyway, what happened next? There was Arthur Clarke, who was also a young Britisher at that time, working as an engineer, and he had the idea that you could actually do communication in space. He invented the communication satellite and wrote an article about it in Wireless World in 1946. So that was sort of the second move into space as a commercial enterprise. And Arthur Clarke then, of course, became famous as a writer of science fiction, had a big influence. His science fiction was excellent, and also technically quite accurate. He understood what you could do and what you could not do. And he also had a lot of imagination. So he, to a large extent, influenced our thinking. The last time I saw Arthur Clarke was a great occasion. It was in the town of Telluride, which is in Colorado. There was a meeting, and a lot of interesting people were there, including Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, who very rarely goes to meetings. He happened to live there, so he came. And there was Arthur Clarke, who never traveled. He was living in Sri Lanka. He loved Sri Lanka. He lived, after he became a successful writer, he settled down in Sri Lanka, and he never traveled. In fact, he had some sort of post-polio problem. He had polio as a child, and he had some sort of paralysis as a result. Anyway, but there he was in Telluride. There's a beautiful three-dimensional hologram, right like that in front of us, in beautiful Technicolor, and talking. We all could see him. He couldn't see us. That's the marvel of modern communications, which he never foresaw. And he was making jokes about that. He said, you know, he invented the communication satellite. He never thought you could actually travel in a hologram with your message. That was beyond his imagination. He said, always dream as far ahead as you can, but don't imagine that that's all there will be. There will always be other things besides. So he was in great form. And so I got involved with space, and one of the projects I was involved with was a nuclear rocket which combined the excitements of nuclear with the excitements of space. It's a thing called Orion, which is different from the Orion that's now being developed. It was a bomb-propelled spacecraft which we tried to develop, starting now in the year 1957, which was the year the Sputnik went up. And that was a great occasion because it became then an international sporting event. The Russians started it out with the Sputnik, putting the first satellite into orbit. And so Kennedy, who was then president, decided the United States had to do something in response. So we should do something even better, and that would be to go to the moon. So he had this program, which he called Apollo, to go to the moon and to actually get people to land on the moon and come back. And he promoted that. And we had the rival program, which was called Orion, which would do it very much cheaper and better with bombs. And technically, that made a great deal of sense. We had a wonderful leader who was called Ted Taylor, who was a young guy, younger than me. And so he was then around maybe 30. And the best boss I ever had, and really a great guy. And so he had this dream of going into space with bombs. And of course, the beauty of it was that you carried lots and lots and lots of bombs, thousands of bombs. And that was, of course, the whole point, that you got rid of your bombs really fast. So it was like the V2 program. I mean, it would be militarily completely harmless, would not kill anybody, but a wonderful way of getting rid of your bombs. And so that was our driving motivation, that we could explore the solar system, explore the universe, and also get rid of bombs. And it seemed to be such a wonderful thing to do. And we hoped also to collaborate with the Russians. And they got quite interested too. We did talk to the Russians about this, and they never actually started a program. But they would have gone along. If we had actually started, they would have followed, undoubtedly. It would have been, in many ways, a better world than we have today. But of course, we were competing with von Braun, who by that time, of course, had come to America and was running our missile program instead of the German one. He was good at both. And, well, von Braun was a far better politician, of course, and he had the inside track. So Apollo went ahead and we didn't. And looking back, it's not at all surprising. I mean, there was one fatal flaw to this bomb-propelled spacecraft, that it made a lot of contamination. It meant as you went up, you went bang, 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 bang up into space. Every time you went bang, that was a few kilotons of fission products. So it would have contaminated the landscape quite considerably. And that became quickly, of course, well known to the public, and quite rightly resented. And the only thing that made it look sensible was that at the same time when this was going on, the military was exploding bombs in the atmosphere by the megaton. They were exploding huge bombs, both the Americans and Russians at that time, exploding about 100 megatons every year. And that was contaminating the Earth already tremendously. And what we would have added to that was less than 1 megaton, so maybe a little less than 1% or so. So you could say, well, that isn't so bad. But still was bad. And as time went on, of course, that became obvious that this was the fatal flaw. So I had the privilege of testifying in Washington at the Senate ratification hearings. This was then 1963, when I was working at the Disarmament Agency, and I was invited to testify at the hearings because I was involved with this bomb project and also was representing the Federation of American Scientists. And so I had then the choice, yes or no. Would I testify for the treaty? This was the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty, which had been negotiated that summer by us at the Disarmament Agency. We had supported the negotiations which actually happened in Moscow. We didn't go to Moscow. Averill Harriman was our negotiator. He did a great job in Moscow. So they had the treaty signed, and then it had to get past the Senate. It had to be ratified by the Senate with 2/3 majority. So that was important. And so I had then to decide, was I for or against? And it meant either Orion or the test ban, and not both. And so I decided for the test ban. And so I testified against Orion and for the test ban. And it was approved by the Senate, and I'm very happy. I mean, by that time it was clear, as soon as you had the test ban, then Orion was definitely dead. And that was just as well. I mean, after the rest of the atmospheric bomb tests had stopped, it was clearly unacceptable to continue with something of this kind. So that was the end of that. But we had a great time while it lasted. So that was my active participation in the space program, which was about 2 years. But it was, I think, in my recollection, it was time well spent. We have, of course, completely outlived that era. The idea we had of exploring Mars, I mean, we had planned to go to Mars in 1965. That was halfway through the Apollo, before the Apollo people had landed. We would have been on Mars. And but how would we have been on Mars? I mean, the way we thought of it was like Darwin on the Beagle. You know, Darwin in 1830 or thereabouts went on this ship, the Beagle, exploring the world. And he went ashore at the Galapagos Islands and walked around and took notes on what he saw, the various species of birds and the famous finches that he discovered there and so forth. And so he traveled around the world for 5 years, tramping over the ground, and came back with all his specimens and his notebooks, spent the rest of his life writing it up. And that was what we had planned to do on Mars, essentially, that we imagined ourselves in our big boots, trudging across Mars and writing down in the notebooks all the things that we saw, and then coming back to the Earth after 5 years and publishing it in the old-fashioned style. Of course, it's totally different, of course, to the way it really happened. Now, of course, you send an instrument to Mars, you're in real-time communication with your instruments all the time. Wideband communication, so you have pictures coming back and forth all the time. The instruments do a far better job of exploring than we could have done. It's far cheaper, far more efficient. If now we gave somehow or other some magic, we had an Orion spaceship without contaminating the Earth, with a payload of 1,000 tons. That was the scale on which we were thinking. The Orion ship was big. It had to be big to carry all those bombs. It also carried a crowd of people. And it had a payload of 1,000 tons. Well, if somebody gave you now for free a payload of 1,000 tons to go to Mars, I don't know what you'd do with it. It's far too much. All the instruments we can think of now, of course, are much smaller and much more efficient and much quicker. The payload costs more than the ship anyway. I don't know what you could do with 1,000 tons. Anyway, that's history. So I shouldn't spend too much time on that stuff. Let me get on to nuclear. The interesting thing about the nuclear bombs is that we were all profoundly thankful for them. At the time when the bombs were exploded, I was actually just getting ready to fly to Okinawa because the British Bomber Command, having finished the war in Germany, they were determined to have a share in the bombing of Japan, which had started seriously in spring of 1945. So the Americans had been bombing Japan very seriously all through the summer of 45. And in August 45, we were flying out to Okinawa, where we would have had some airfields, and we would have put in our little 2 cents worth bombing Japan. That was the plan. So I was due to fly with the Bomber Command. And then suddenly the bombs were dropped, the Japanese surrendered, and we all could go home. And of course we were profoundly thankful. Everybody I know believed that the bombs had ended the war. That's what we were told, and that's what we believed. That's what the Japanese said. And well, it turns out it wasn't true. And now we have a lot of documents from the Japanese side which tell the true story. I had a friend in Princeton called, what's his name? I'm reached the age where I forget people's names too easily. But Ward Wilson is his name. He's just written a book about the surrender of Japan, which I highly recommend. It's not yet published. Anyhow, what is quite clear now when you examine the actual facts is the Japanese did not surrender because of the nuclear bombs. Partly you can tell that from the timing of what actually happened, and it's also from the record. I won't go into too much detail, but the fact of the matter is Hiroshima was August 6th. Russians invaded Manchuria and declared war on Japan August 8th, that was 2 days later. August 9th was the surrender, and well, when the decision was made to surrender. And also the second bomb on Nagasaki was the same day. So it all happened in 3 days. But the timing makes it quite clear that the decision to surrender was actually a response to the Russian invasion and not to the bombs. What happened when the Hiroshima bomb was dropped, there was some discussion among the leading Japanese generals. They decided not to hold an official meeting with the emperor. Wasn't serious enough for an official meeting with the emperor. Life went on. They were discussing the rationing of rice and various other things. They were planning for a war. On August 8th, everything changed. On August 8th, the Russians invaded. Immediately, they called a meeting of the Supreme Council, and that's where the decision to surrender was made. That was within 6 hours. And the most detailed evidence comes from the orders that the emperor actually gave to the troops. That in order to get the troops to surrender, of course, that wasn't simple. The whole Japanese tradition was against it. The whole Japanese tradition was you fight to the last man, you never surrender. Surrender is the most dishonorable thing you can do, which for Japanese is much worse than dying. So it was a question whether the troops would actually do what the emperor said if he told them to surrender. So he had to make a careful argument, which is written down. We know what the argument was. He did not mention the bombs. In his order to the troops, he's arguing from history. So clearly he had a very acute sense of history. His grandfather was the great Emperor Meiji, who whom everybody respected. He was really the sort of the modernizer of Japan, the founder of the modern Japanese military and the founder of the Japanese state. What did the Emperor Meiji do? In 1895, he surrendered. And that's what the Emperor Hirohito in 1945 wrote about. He said, look, in 1895, we had the war with China. We beat the Chinese, and we occupied Manchuria. That was when the Japanese moved into Manchuria the first time. And then the Russians intervened. And the Russians threatened, not only did threaten Manchuria, but they threatened Japan. And the Emperor Meiji surrendered. He gave up Manchuria and made peace with the Russians. So the Hirohito said in 1945, look, my grandfather did that, we have to do it too. And that was his argument. Clearly, the Russian invasion was a total disaster for the Japanese if they had continued to fight. Would have meant the Russians occupying most of Japan. The Russians were closer than the Americans. They were ready to invade. Would have meant Japan would have been a Soviet satellite. Anyhow, so that was it. That's all I'll say about that. So the bombs are not responsible for winning World War II. It's important to know that. If we're thinking about getting rid of the bombs today, because the strongest argument for holding on to the nuclear bombs is that they work, that they actually finished a war. It is not true. Anyhow, let me talk a little bit about the genomics. That's actually in the course of history, it's turned out that the genome is much more important than the nuclear, really. What nuclear did for us was nothing like as important as we thought. We had expected it would transform the world, but actually the genome has done much more. So I had this encounter with the genome very early. In the year 1945, I was working for the Air Force, and Francis Crick, who was an English contemporary, he was 5 years older than me, was working for the Navy. And he had been working for the Navy for the whole war, for 6 years long. And this was for him a terrible situation. He was very depressed and miserable. He had been a physics student before the war, and he'd been working for the Navy for 6 years, and he said he'll never amount to anything as a scientist. He had spent 6 years forgetting everything that he'd ever learned, and it was too late for him to start afresh. And so he was very depressed and miserable. And he said, maybe what I'll have to do is to start afresh as a biologist. Then maybe something good will happen in biology. He had this notion of maybe studying the genome. And anyhow, I said to him, no, that's a mistake. You will be too old by the time biology takes off. It's too late for you, and you better go back to physics. So that was my contribution to genomics. It showed even a 20-year-old is not always right. Anyhow, so Crick actually then decided to become a biologist. And he ended up 7 years later with Jim Watson discovering the double helix which was sort of the determining event of the 20th century. You might say it's the biggest scientific discovery of the 20th century. A really marvelous discovery, because it turns out the genome is understandable. That was something which we never expected. Because when you look at a human being, it's so enormously complicated, so beautifully put together in such an elaborate fashion with all the brains and the spirit and everything that goes with it. And somehow this little chemical, something in the egg, tells the egg how to turn into a human being. How could that possibly happen? But whatever chemical it is that's responsible for that must be tremendously complicated. We all believe that this, what we call the genome, which was whatever chemicals actually were containing the information for producing a human being, must be something very, very, very sophisticated and difficult and clever. And then Crick and Watson discovered it's actually the simplest thing you can imagine. It's a much simpler molecule than anybody had imagined possible. It's just a simple string of building blocks, just lined up in one simple line. And all you need to know is the order of the blocks. There are only 4 different kinds. You can call them A, B, C, and D, or you can call them C, A, T, and U, or whatever it is, for their chemical names. And that's all the information there is. It's as simple as that. It was quite an amazing surprise for everybody that somehow or other we are coded, people are coded in such a very, very simple way. Not only people, but everything else alive. When you add together all the 20 million species and add together all their genes, the whole amount of information is 1 petabyte, which is very small as databases go, much less than Google or Wikipedia. Could easily be written on a couple of disks and put into a machine and read. The whole of everything that lives on this planet is coded in this tiny database. It is quite amazing. So it means somehow just by that one discovery, we're enabled somehow or other to grasp everything that's alive. So it was a wonderful time to be a biologist. So that was Crick's genius, was to be in the right place at the right time. I should talk a little bit about what's going to happen as a result of the genome. I'm impressed with the possibilities for the genome being an art form rather than a science. How can you make such a wonderful biosphere? This planet is so full of beauty and so full of variety. How can you do that with just a few little bits of information? I went to the flower show in Philadelphia. Some of you may have been there. It happens every year. It's said to be the biggest flower show in the world, but I don't know whether that's true. But anyhow, it's a great thing to visit. It happens every year, I think in April or something. I forget, April or May. Anyhow, so what you see, you see there a big crowd of people who are real experts at growing plants, growing beautiful flowers and trees and shrubs. They devote their lives to it. It's partly amateurs and partly professionals. they just love to show off what they can do. It is a form of art, which I think is something we all love in a way, and including people like me who never wouldn't know how to grow anything. But there's a similar thing in San Diego in California, which is a reptile show, where you have people who are breeding snakes and lizards, and they show off every year what they can do, and that's also beautiful. And of course, it's even more exciting for the kids. And I took a grandson there, and it was a big problem to get him out of the building without actually buying a snake. Anyhow, that's what people love to do, breeding plants and breeding animals. There are similar dog breeders, and there are cat breeders, and there are pigeon breeders. And it's something we love to do. And that's going to be much better and even more exciting when those people are genetically programming what these plants and animals can be. So instead of just taking a litter of cats and picking out the ones you're fancying, you write the genome for a cat and design it yourself. It'll be a new art form, which I think will be very important and perhaps as characteristic of the coming century as the cinema was for the 20th century. You could say the 20th century was in a way the century of the cinema being the most popular and the biggest art form. I think it's quite likely that genetic engineering will do the same thing for the next century. And that's quite apart from the practical side of things. It corresponds to something that is very much in the human tradition. And now we have the tools, or we shall have the tools pretty soon. If you look at the time scale, we're sequencing genomes at the rate of around 1,000 species a year or something like that at the moment. It's going fairly fast. But what's much more impressive is the rate of growth. That the rate of growth of sequencing is something like a factor of 100 every decade. So it started 40 years ago with a single species of virus. Then it was a bacterium, and then it was a nematode worm. And then they jumped to the human. And then it became the rat and the mouse and the cat and the dog and so on. And now it's thousands of species a year. And the price is correspondingly going down, also by a factor of 100 every decade. Just because data processing gets so much better. So it means that about 20 years from now, we'll be finished with the whole biosphere. That 20 years from now, we'll have sequenced everything, essentially, everything that's alive. So that'll be a kind of a landmark. And at that point, then, it will make sense to think of colonizing space in a quite different way. That instead of going out somewhere like we thought of going to Mars, wearing a spacesuit and trudging around and collecting data, you'll send an entire genome of a whole biosphere. And it can grow, and it will be adapted to the planet where you send it, or anywhere else in the universe. There are lots of places you can think of sending a biosphere. And the size of the biosphere is absurdly small, if you think of it in terms of bits of information. It could all be contained in a few micrograms of DNA. Say something the size of a chicken egg or something like that could actually contain the entire 20 million species to bring a whole planet to life. So it's I think, an interesting thought. That colonizing space is not just about people, it's about life as a whole. And we'll have the tools to do it in a sensible way. That's to say, producing an environment that's properly adapted to the place where you're going. And the essential tool is a warm-blooded plant. For some reason, nature never produced warm-blooded plants on this planet. We don't know why. It's sort of obvious that that will be a thing to do. But nature has produced warm-blooded animals. Of course, we are the best example of that. But never produced warm-blooded plants. It's difficult to understand why. It would be a big advantage to a plant to be able to grow in the Arctic, say, and not have to close down in winter. Anyhow, but we could design a warm-blooded plant, and it could grow a greenhouse around itself, so it could be the habitat for all kinds of other creatures. So you'd imagine these living greenhouses using the sunlight that's coming in to make a habitat for everything else. It would be a nice way to make a planet come to life. And suppose, assuming it's not already inhabited, if there are natural creatures already there, of course you don't want to invade them. And by all means, leave it alone. But as we probably, most likely it'll turn out that these planets, except for the Earth, are dead, then I don't see any harm in bringing them to life. And it would be a great challenge. Not only planets, there are also other places to go. And in particular, of course, there's asteroids, of which there are millions. Comets, which are even in the billions, and so on and so on. All you have to have is warm-blooded plants with some sort of optical concentrators to concentrate sunlight, so some sort of system of mirrors which they could easily grow. They don't have to be optically perfect, just essentially just rough light buckets that concentrate sunlight. And those creatures then could live on all kinds of places where sunlight is available, but even much further away than the Earth. Well, let's come to the last section, which is about computing. There, of course, again, a total surprise. We started out with the computer project, which it was actually running during the war, a thing called the ENIAC in Philadelphia, or it was actually built by the military for calculating artillery shell trajectories. And it never was used during the war. It came too late. It was actually, it became operational in 1946. But it was the prototype then for all the computers we've had since. And then in Princeton at the same year, in 1946, John von Neumann, who was a great mathematician, who happened to be at my institute, the Institute for Advanced Study, decided he would build a computer himself, but this one would be intelligent. That is, he invented software, which was the thing to make a computer intelligent. Software meant you treat instructions for operating the computer in the same way that you treat numbers. They're both the same. They're all numbers. So the numbers are, in fact, the instructions to run the machine. And that's what you call software. So that was his idea. So instead of just having a mechanical machine, you had a machine that could organize itself, tell itself how to run itself. So that's what he did. He built it at our institute. And that was going on when I arrived here, which was 1947. And it was a very exciting time. We had there a whole lot of people whom von Neumann invited, and so it was an extremely lively time. And especially meteorologists, the people who came were mostly meteorologists. Already at that time, climate studies was the important thing to do, and computer was what you needed to do climate. And that's what they were doing. Right then, at the beginning, when the machine first started to run in 1951, and the first climate models were then very soon after that. And in the meantime, at night they did hydrogen bombs on the same machine. Von Neumann, of course, was interested in both. And there were a few people who did simulation of biological evolution, particularly a young man called Niels Baricelli, who has never been famous, but he was a great man, who was doing simulated evolution right from the beginning, understanding how genes can evolve on a computer. And he got it all right. He had an amazing, because this computer had a total memory of 4 kilobytes, which by present day standards is microscopic. But with that tiny memory, he managed to program a simulated evolution program, which was quite realistic. So you had these creatures which could mutate from generation to generation and replicate, and then from time to time parasitize each other. And so he evolved in generations, which then quickly they evolved into predators and prey. And so you got the whole biosphere somehow appearing from nothing. So he understood evolution in a way better than anybody else. So that was the beginning of the computer age. And then von Neumann died, and our institute committed the biggest mistake of its whole existence, got rid of the computer and everything connected with it. It was the mathematicians' revenge. They thought this bunch of uncouth people who came, the engineers, were not worthy of this high-class academic community that we were supposed to be. So they got rid of them as fast as possible. It was very sad, and so the machine was sent away to the Smithsonian in Washington, and the climate people disappeared, and the biologists disappeared. So we lost a great chance. We could have been the world leaders in 2 fields of science, climate studies and computer science. We blew it, anyway. That's just a lesson. So I was powerless. I tried very hard to keep the thing going, but I was a very junior faculty member, and my voice against all these great mathematicians didn't count. So anyway, since then, of course, things moved, and the beauty of it is that von Neumann never imagined what was actually going to happen. Von Neumann always dreamed of huge, big machines. That was what he loved. And he thought of his machine as just the smallest machine that would ever exist, because he was the first. All the ones after that would be bigger and better. That was his dream. And the story goes, again, it's an urban legend, I'm not sure whether it's true. The story goes that he was asked how many computers would the United States need, and he answered 18. That was assuming, of course, you had one for each department of the government or something like that. Anyhow, so that his imagination did not go beyond that. Of course, what really happened was something so much more wonderful, that the things, instead of getting bigger and bigger, they got smaller and smaller. Computers got quick and smart and cheap. And amazingly quickly, they became toys for 3-year-olds. And that's what really changed the world. That now we are all addicts. And it brought the world together in an amazing fashion. It's easy to get used to it, but it is quite astonishing how things have changed. I mean, I would say the collapse of the Soviet Union probably was caused more by personal computers than anything else. The fact that people became powerful, you couldn't really control them as soon as they had personal computers. And of course, the internet was part of that, and the World Wide Web, and all the other institutions that have grown out of computers, not to mention Facebook, which came later. But I think it was actually the personal computer, not Ronald Reagan, that caused the Soviet Union to collapse. And anyhow, so what I should come to an end. It's what's happening now. I think I'd like to talk a little bit about the next revolution, which I think is neurology. That's the science of the brain. And I would say that there's an event which happened about 5 years ago, which is completely unknown, which is sort of the equivalent of the double helix. But we don't yet understand it. That's the thing called HAR1 and HAR2, which was discovered by a young man called David Horsler, who is a professor at University of California, Santa Cruz. He is, in fact, a biologist who has never done biology. He's the modern style of biologist. He's only trained as a computer scientist. He thinks computers, but he's still a great biologist. So what he actually did was to collect genomes, particularly looking at the last 300 million years, that is, since the time when mammals evolved. And mammals separated from reptiles and birds about 300 million years ago. So he collected genomes which were enough for his purpose: chickens, dogs, cats, rats, mice, chimpanzees, and human. So 7 species, I think, is what he took. So only 1 species of birds, 6 species of mammals. And he looked at the genomes to see what was different about humans. And he found 2 places where something funny happened. And he called them HAR1 and HAR2. HAR means human accelerated region. So these are parts of the genome where something funny happened between chimps and humans. So look at HAR1. It's identical all the way from chickens, rats, mice, dogs, and cats, and chimps. For 300 million years, It did not change. So it must be doing something really important. So it was strongly selected, could not be changed because it was doing something essential to survival. So it's doing something very important. We don't know what it is. And then you look at humans and it's very different. Has 18 changes between chimp and human. That was 5 million years, just the last 5 million years. Somehow or other, its function must have changed drastically. It actually changed by 18 base pairs. Well, what do we know about HAR1? First of all, it's not a gene. It has nothing to do with coding. It's some sort of, it just looks like an ordinary piece of DNA, not coding for anything. It must be somehow telling the genome what to do. It's an organizing, it must have some basic organizing function. We don't know the language yet. We understand the coding part of the genome, which is only 3%. The other 97% of the genome is really mysterious. That's clearly going to be essential. That other 97% is where most of the action really is. But you don't yet speak the language. Anyway, this is then something absolutely different from what we've done before. Understanding the part of the genome that doesn't code. Well, what do we know about HAR1? We know when it's active and we know where it's active. The time it's active is the second trimester of pregnancy, which is roughly when you'd expect to be most crucial. Second trimester, that means halfway through the pregnancy. So that's the time when the basic structure of the body is being established, particularly the brain. It's the time when the separation of the neurons into different parts of the brain are happening. And where this HAR1 is active at that time is something that everybody can guess. It's the cortex of the brain. So that's the time when the brain is organizing itself into the part that thinks, and the part that sees, and the part that hears, and so on. It's when the main functions of the brain are laid down. It's just then, and HAR1 clearly has something to do with that. So this is telling us something about human nature. Well, what about HAR2? It's a similar piece of DNA. It's active at about the same time. And where would you guess that would be? Anybody like to guess? Anyway, it's the wrist. That's what's different in humans. The wrist that enables us to do everything we do with the hands. So the brain and the hands are the two things that make us human. Anyway, I like that. So I think this is going to be the big science of the next 100 years. To understand, first of all, what the 97% of the genome is doing. That's the science of genomics, treated not just as a set of genes, but as a whole system, understanding how to talk genomics, and understanding the difference between chimps and humans. So it's the science of non-coding regions of the genome and the science of human nature. I think that's what we have to look forward to for the next 100 years. So that's enough.